happiness is, as I see it today, it's a result. All right. And so, I'm never just focusing on happiness, right? Happiness is like the cake, all right? But I'm focusing on the ingredients. So, recognizing that, like, all right, how am I with my gratitude this morning? Right? How am I with my patience this morning? How am I within my connections with my community this morning? And recognizing that, when I'm able to find the right ingredients for, the dish that I'm trying to make just for the day, right? Is that's where I'm able to find the happiness.
Hey, y'all. Welcome back to the Stacking Days podcast, where we highlight underrepresented journeys of sobriety from within the BIPOC community. I'm your host, Ray Donovan, and today we have Brandon joining us all the way from Nairobi, Kenya. So needless to say, we are in for a treat. I imagine we're going to cover a lot of subject matter today. I've been watching and observing Brandon from afar, and I'm sure we're going to get into everything from homelessness and rock bottoms to being a change agent and building platforms for good. So if you can't tell, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So without further ado, let's get into it. Brandon, welcome to the show.
And thank you so much for having me here. Thank you so much for just celebrating my existence, man. It's really an honor, an absolute honor to be of service. So yeah, thank you so much.
You got it, man. Let's get right into it. I want to start, kind of at the beginning, if we could. This show is all about, alcohol, sobriety, alcohol free, and the journey and the pursuit of that. So I'd love to be able to go back to your origin and where your relationship with alcohol started, and we can kind of just take it chronologically from there to the point where you moved on to certainly greener pastures.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a great way to get started. So, when I'm sort of looking at my origin story, I'm going to utilize sort of there's like an epilogue, right, for my drinking, right? And it's not to create this canvas of like, oh, woe is me, but to allow ourselves to understand some of the conditioning that we might have experienced without even recognizing it, right? So my initial connection with alcohol actually started from my grandmother's household. I was raised by my grandma for first couple of years of my life, right? And my first ever chore in that household was to take out the beer cans while the guys in our family drank during the Redskin games, right? We're in Washington, D.C., right? So, genuinely, like, it became this little sort of funny game that they would leave, the smallest of smidgens for me, right? Obviously, I'm not getting drunk. I'm like 5, 6 years old, right? But, right, when I'm starting to think about my first conditioning is, the first time I actually saw this and connected with it, it was at a really young age, right? It was me watching, my grandparents, my uncles, my cousins, right, sit around and drinking and saying like, hey, you could even be a part of this, right? And so, that was like probably my first understanding, right? Like, let's say Easter egg, right? But then, I really didn't come back around it until I was, around 18 years old, right? I spent a real short stint in college. I was at University of Pittsburgh, and that was the next time I was introduced to this as like, hey, this is how you consume it. You use this to black out, and you never have to worry about anything else, right? And so, I took that. As I said, it was a really short stint in college. And next thing you know, I was back in Atlanta, right, which is where I spent a lot of my formative years, right? And at the time, I was in Southwest Atlanta off Pryor Road, which for people who know anything about Atlanta, that is it's a wild part of Atlanta for sure. And at the time, we were.
Did you just find yourself there, or how did you end up in that area of Atlanta, not being from there?
To be 100% honest, part of my story is, the family that I was raised by, we are the last slaves in America, right? My grandmother ran off of a cotton field at 19 years old, right, in South Carolina.
Damn.
So, the ecosystem, right, that I grew up in, it was it created a different rhythm, right? It created a language that is only spoken in certain parts of America, right? So, although I traveled
Mm.
everywhere, I always found myself in a very similar neighborhood as I grew up in, right? So, for me, being in
Gotcha.
Southwest Atlanta was no different than Southeast DC, was no different than East New York. Like I've lived in all these places. So, at the time I was in Southwest Atlanta.
Cool.
There's 8 of us in a 3 bedroom, no hot water, no electricity. And we're just surviving. And during that time, that's when I started to create my own connection with alcohol. Right before this, it was a lot of people sort of giving me their perspectives, and it was around that time that I started being like, all right, this is going to be my tool. And from there, it just started to grow in different ways. And yeah, just kept on experiencing it. I'm not sure if you want me to give you the whole story right now or just sort of the introduction. How would you like me to fuel the
No,
fire?
I mean let's get into it. I mean, what did your conversation look like when you started to make alcohol your own, and and what was it doing for you at that point in your life that maybe it wasn't doing for you when you were in in Pittsburgh or before then?
Okay, yeah, that's great. So yeah, when I started recognizing that I could have my own conversation with alcohol, it would genuinely start off from the concept of waking up in these mornings, and I mean like honestly, man, living off Prior Road and that moments and a lot of chaos is going on, break-ins every day, police checkpoints, the whole nine. You start recognizing, man, you have limited resources and you have a great need to escape, right? And so,
Hmm.
I started, understanding, in that season, right? Like, okay, I could go to this store for like $2.25, get a 40 ounce. And with 2 of these, right, like it doesn't even feel like we don't have hot water, right? Like I don't even have to worry about taking a shower
Yeah.
today, right? Or even with this, like, oh, give me the courage to say, like, hey, man, we're just gonna light candles around this house, or just create this space that didn't feel as maybe raw, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's sort of what started it. And to be honest, and sort of just like propel us a little bit more forward in the story, I was actually at that time I was growing as a musician. All right. Um,
Okay.
and so through this story, I'm utilizing the tough times to sort of drink through it, and I'm focusing on the music, and not recognizing that by escaping the emotions during the day, I'm recording it at night. All right.
Mm.
And so what
Yeah.
happens is like because the music business is business like everything else. You put in enough effort, you'll get to where you seek, right? So next thing you know, I'm finding myself with pretty popular music. We're touring, we're doing big shows, and finding out that the way that I am expressing this anger through this music is the only thing that is connecting. All right. But
Mm.
understanding in that moment that I know I'm much more than the way that I'm expressing myself. Right. And so,
Right.
really when things sort of, let's just say, like, boiled over, right? I put all my eggs in this music basket. My music was coming from a place that I didn't feel really represented who I was. We end off on
Hmm.
a tour, and I'm like looking back at sort of this chaos that we created during this tour, and I'm like, all right, I can't do this anymore. So I step away from music. I
Mm.
have no background, never had a job or anything, and didn't believe that I had another identity that I could find in myself. And that's when my
Mm.
drinking really started to spiral, right? And so from like 25 through 29, it just became that space.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, you've kind of gotten to this impasse in your life where you feel completely lost, and without any direction, you almost started to drown yourself, so to speak, in the alcohol.
Yeah, absolutely. It's through the lens of, I told myself, I mean, I started working on music at my first like record deal at 13 years old, right? So, now I'm 25,
Mm.
making it to what I consider is like, at the precipice, right, of stardom, and recognizing like, oh, I don't want to do it like this at all. And I think,
Mm.
right, that there's no option for me to do this unless it's this pathway, and this doesn't feel right. And so yeah, in that moment, it was just spiraling out and being like, all right, I don't know if the universe has a place for me. All right. And really
Mm.
allow myself to be stuck in this projection or this concept that the only value that I have on this planet is just by making music, which is no longer, feeding me. Right. And so for there, like
Yeah.
from there, it became like, yeah, a 4 year, like genuine struggle. Like I had already been, utilizing it for different ways, but after that, it became 4 years of, me just, just sort of trying to escape in every way possible.
Mm. One of the things that I have recognized in just kind of watching you and just in preparing for our conversation is that you're a very introspective individual, right? And I find that it's unique that you, even in kind of the grips of the alcohol, you still had an extreme amount of introspection around where and how you showed up in this experience of life. And I can imagine that while that can serve one, very, very well, if you are in a position where you're coming from a place of pain, that type of recognition can only be probably more demoralizing than motivating. So it makes sense to me that you're trying to escape this kind of self critique and this realization that where am I going to be able to show up in this space? I know that I'm meant for something, but I cannot see the path for the life of me into how I'm going to get there.
And what's what I really appreciate, and I'm going to just reiterate in sort of just different language here, is allowing. For me, it was a really big thing because I was learning to express myself, and I was surrounded by a community that also felt that this was an acceptable and a celebrated way of representation, right? But recognizing
Right.
that art is open to interpretation, right? So like we're making this music and we're all this angry, right? So we all feel as if it's okay.
Yep.
But then once it's, taken from the neighborhood and put on a national stage and recognized like, oh, they don't receive it like this. They're not hearing this as somebody who doesn't have hot water and electricity. They're just hearing this as somebody who's angry as hell, right? And they're just connecting from that lens.
Yep.
And then, within there,
Yep.
having that, really reflection and being just hyper aware of like, okay, they're not going to receive me in the way that I'm trying to speak if I'm doing it just from this standpoint. And so from there, I gave myself the grace to step away, but didn't recognize how much of a whirlpool I would find myself in, just for not recognizing that there are so many more identities I would be able to step into.
Yeah. So let's kind of move through the next 4 years. I'm assuming a portion of those 4 years is probably pretty blurry. You probably also have some pretty deep memories of those 4 years that still have an impact on you to this day. Can you just give me a snap of what that time looked like for you, and then ultimately, most importantly, what was kind of like the final straw that broke the camel's back, where you started moving into a new direction, either voluntarily or by way of of happenstance?
Great question. So at that time, let's say 25, there was right before this, there was this period of running away from myself, not recognizing you take you with you where you go, right? Or anywhere you go.
Yeah.
So, first I left Atlanta, moved to New York for a bit, did the exact same thing in New York, and then moved to DC. So at 25, I'm in Southeast DC, right? On Minnesota Avenue, which, just another very, very wild corner of America. And genuinely, when I look back at some of the things that I was experiencing then, it wasn't even me. The entire ecosystem was, suffering from an oppression that we were all trying to fight in different ways, right? I mean, just to give sort of a viewpoint, is for me to go get fruits and vegetables from Minnesota Ave in Washington, D.C., inside Washington, D.C., right? It would take me 2 buses and 2 trains, all right, to be able to go get fruits and vegetables from my neighborhood, right? So about an hour and a half trip, right? For me to
Right.
even get to the first bus stop, I've already passed 3 liquor stores.
Right.
All right. So at the time, and our liquor stores on Minnesota Ave, they open up at 7 a.m. Right. Right.
Right. And
So,
people are there.
oh, it's packed. It's packed. It's packed at 7 a.m. So, I was trying to escape myself for a bit when I moved to DC, but the environment, it was turbulent. It was just tough. And especially at the time, I hadn't really sat down with my thinking. What were you saying?
No, I was just going to say. I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time in DC. I went to Howard University for a stint, and so when you talk about DC and Southeast, like I have pictures in my mind of the city at that time. I mean, and DC is a rough town. I mean, just it's just a rough town. And a lot of callousness, a lot of pain in that city, and it certainly feels dark. So when you paint that picture of, the liquor stores opening at 7 a.m., I can see those liquor stores and I could see the people outside of those stores at 7 a.m. So it was just bringing back some memories for me. That's all.
It's wild when you really recognize that, DC, you cross over the Potomac River into Southeast and it's a whole different world. Right. And so, just the way that in that moment I was, watching people survive, they were just reiterating some of the habits that we had all learned, right? Probably from similar scenarios as, myself, right? Just watching others, trying to escape and really heal, right? Through these moments.
Yeah.
And so, I spent the next couple of years burning every bridge that I was able to build. It just sort of culminated in, me ended up being homeless for about 9 months. All right. And at that time, I was either sleeping, off of Minnesota Ave and Benning Road, or I would go up to U Street by the Busboys and Poets. And at that time, I was drinking this gin. It's called Fleischmann's. It's probably still available, right? And you can get a fifth of this, right, for $6.99, right? So I was focused on having, 3 fifths a day. So I would have 3 bottles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So, my main goal was about $25 a day. So it'd be 3 of those bottles and 2 double cheeseburgers from McDonald's, which was obviously right down the street as well. And so,
that was right on the corner of 14th and U.
You know it, right there, right? So just that was sort of my routine for a while, and then it was a random Tuesday. I hadn't showered probably in, I don't know, a little bit over 2 weeks at that time. Right, I know it's definitely past 10 days, and my sort of my routine would be to drink a bottle early in the morning and then just try and ride the buses and trains all day. You hop a turnstile or you just sort of slide on and you just sort of have free accommodations for the day. So I've fallen asleep on the back of a bus, and one of the older women who was on that bus, she just saw the state that I was in and she was like, I think this young man is about to die. And so she called the ambulance for me, right? And, next thing you know, I woke up in the hospital with a 0.52, all right, blood alcohol content. So, I think that means like 52% of your blood is alcohol at that point in time. And, for me, it was just a regular Tuesday. I think it was like 1:15 or 1:30 on a Tuesday this happened. But yeah, that was sort of the state that I was in. But from there, it was interesting is that, it was the first time that I had to just start being open, talk with, my mother about this, talk with my grandmother about this, just let people know, how much I was hurting. And from there, it started its own journey of finding, new ways to heal where I didn't have to do it alone.
Yeah, man, Brandon, that's a lot. Anytime I hear these stories of, when folks kind of, literally are just kind of crashing and burning and dying, and then what it takes to kind of come back to life. Whenever I hear these stories, it makes me think of the phoenix rising from the ashes, right? I mean, you pretty much have burnt out, on your deathbed, either literally or figuratively. And what it takes to kind of move the momentum in the opposite direction, right, is enormous. I listened to a piece that you penned where you were kind of comparing the concept of transparency and invisibility, I think it was,
Yeah.
right? And if you could, in a kind of quick synopsis, give the listeners a sense of that transition for you going from invisibility into a world of transparency, because it sounds about a lot of that's where you had to start moving towards to reconcile some of those relationships, with the folks who cared about you, but more importantly, the relationship with yourself.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you brought up that piece, transparency, man. And yeah, I think it's, yeah, definitely apt for this moment. So as that time I was drinking, I was trying to be, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Right? It's a fantastic book from back in the day, and really just hiding into the shadows of life, and like genuinely, like, I mean, I wasn't responding to text messages, anything. I was living my whole own life in this moment, and I just wanted to be hidden away from the light of the world. All right. And then, on that day when, that happened, and it was a little bit further than that. So when I woke up in the hospital, I'm half of my family, last slaves in America, other half, first freed, slave civilization. All right. And that's St. Kitts, right? Tiniest island. So nobody talks about it, but it is still part of our history. Right. And so, yeah, other half is from St. Kitts, right? The population right now is probably less than 30,000. So I wake up in DC, and the nurse who is talking to me is from St. Kitts. All right. I had just lost my grandfather that year, which was, obviously, or not obviously, but was just genuinely, part of, my tension that I was experiencing. And so to wake up and hear this accent that is really distinct, I'm like, what? And, she's asking me these questions. She's like, I just don't get it. She's like, why would you give up right now? She's like, look at you. She's like, you're a handsome, able young man. You look extremely intelligent. And she's like, and you just decided to give up? She's like, I just can't get this. And, as I'm hearing, that dialogue, obviously in that moment for me, it felt like, my grandfather speaking to me. And yeah, I had to sit within this truth, that, no matter what I was doing, I was waking up every single day, right? No matter how much I didn't want to wake up at night through my practices, the universe is waking me up every day. And so, I had to start asking myself, not only like, or stop asking myself, what does this moment mean to me, right? But what do I mean to this moment? All right. So, why is this universe waking me up every day? Why is this universe giving me this story? Why is it giving me this capacity and capability? And from there, I started, the idea of like, all right, I'm not going to be invisible. I'm going to be transparent. Right. So everything that I'm experiencing, y'all are going to experience it with me. Right. I am not perfect. I am just person. Right. And that really just became, yeah, sort of the guidelines for the next couple of years.
Man, I love that, and I appreciate you kind of laying that out. I think that's incredibly powerful kind of perspective to take on one's own embarkment into healing, for sure. Talk to me about what those early days of sobriety looked like for you. I mean, you're in the hospital. You're sitting here today, so I'm assuming you left the hospital at some point. What did it look like for you to reintegrate, or to just integrate into the world as someone who now had to field everything in a very real way?
It's another great question. I mean, honestly, the first couple of days was so much flooding back to reality, that it's tough to even put a perfect word to it, right? It just feels like, I think the analogy I can use is just you're in a whirlpool of reality, right? Of just being, the first time, like during my drinking, there was a phase where I hadn't looked in the mirror in like 6 months, all right? Because I knew I looked like death, right? My eyes were so sunken that I was terrified to look in the mirror. And so to have, doctors, family, people be around you and be like, yo, do you see you right now? Right? Like, and finally having to take that look, it was a real experience. And, genuinely, I was blessed enough in or in that moment or in that season to be able to already start recognizing like, look, if I'm gonna do this, if I'm gonna find this transparency, I'm gonna need to do it in a place where I can shine the best. And so I was lucky enough to where I had a friend to a friend who put me in touch with a farm in South Georgia. Um, it's called Zenithland Farm, Perry, Georgia. That's the name of the city in Perry, Georgia. And I moved to a pecan farm, which was supposed to be for 3 months, and I stayed for like 7. And I stayed and worked on a pecan farm, picking up sticks, right? Every single day, 5,000-acre pecan farm. My entire job, pick up sticks for 9, 10 hours a day. And that was really where I gave myself the space to finally start thinking. I mean, 'cause that's all you got. All you got is time, right? Just you picking up sticks. All you got is time to think. And I allowed myself to really start working from there, start trying to get aligned with my passions that were just in that season, with impatience. And from there, I started just allowing myself to grow.
It's interesting. You when you start talking to people in recovery, if you want, or in healing from, substances and from traumas and all of these things that we're trying to better ourselves from. I like to say, at least on this podcast, that I'm just kind of like program agnostic. I don't really care how people go about pursuing their sobriety. You know what I mean? So long as they can do it. Some folks do 12 steps. Some people pick up sticks on pecan farms, right? It's like whatever works for you to get to a place where you could do some of that inner work and silence the surroundings so that you can do that inner work. I think is fantastic. And maybe you didn't even necessarily know what you were getting into in, heading down to Georgia to work on this farm. But it sounds like once you got hold of it, you recognized this is where you needed to be in order to continue to grow.
Exactly. And, one thing I recognize, and the analogy I think I'm going to use for this moment is, let's think of ourselves as a house. All right. And, this, yeah, I'm just going to use the analogy where the exterior of a house, right? And so, for years, I've allowed myself to sort of fall apart, right? Like the shades are coming off and all these things. And so I recognized, like in that moment, like, okay, this season is going to be about the rebuild, right? But here's the good thing about this is that if I sit down and I make this rebuild my entire focus, right? I don't focus on what it's going to look like when it's done. I don't focus on what, the people I'm going to invite over after it's beautiful. But if I just focus on this rebuild, right, that I might only have to do it in this manner one time in my life. All right. And so, I jumped into staying on the farm for months. After that, I went and lived in a halfway house for 6 months, right? Just when I went back to Atlanta, I was like, all right, if I'm going to reintegrate, I'm going to do it while I have a huge safety net through this halfway house, even if it's me and 50-year-old white dudes living together, right? I'm just going to create this. And, I gave myself about like a year and a half of time of just being like, nah, just focus on this, and then figure out what it's like to take, a deep breath after this, intense practice, like this submersion.
I love that. Just kind of really being in the moment and in the season that is calling you. I think that's great. I mean, I when you say that, I think of, the moments on the season that I'm in my life right now, and the build that I'm trying to build right now. And I hear you in that you kind of want to do it right. so you don't have to revisit it, in a few months from now, in a few years from now. Like if you can get that foundation, that exterior, secure, then you have something to kind of work with moving forward.
Yeah,
So
and honestly, like, and the reason why I'm just gonna like interject here is that it's not that I'm focusing on right or wrong, right? It's that I'm focusing on the depth of intelligence, right? And so understanding that when I was drinking, right, I gained an entire new intelligence in drinking, right? In being homeless, I gained an entire new intelligence. I could tell you how to get free meals for a month straight in Washington, D.C., right? I can tell you every single liquor store that's open at 7 a.m. I can tell you how to get there off the train station, right? I learned a certain intelligence. And so recognizing in this rebuild, I need to learn the intelligence of me, right? Of, all of these, cracks and crevices, right? I need to like allow myself to start studying like, hey man, where are you softest, right? Where is your strength, right? Where are you hurting? And allowing it that like, I don't have to do this right, but I have to give it the space. I have to give it the right time, right? It deserves its own season. And so just allowing myself to really delve into that and be like, how intelligent can I become about my story? Right? How much intelligence can I have about my perspective and the conditioning of it, right? And the creativity that I can garner from like reclaiming it. And that really became sort of the main focus for that year and a half time. And obviously today as well. It's a daily practice.
Well, let me ask you. So, I mean, I don't want to fast forward too much, but for someone who is not accustomed to going deep into one's self, how did you go about pursuing that exercise in saying, okay, I need to really go deep here as opposed to trying to go wide, because there are some roots here that I need to uncover, and I need to understand, what they're tethered to below. So I'm curious, what did you do to kind of go to that degree of depth and have the attention, quite frankly, to get in there and get into the wound to be able to deal with it?
Yeah, and one thing I think is so beautiful is as I was on that farm, I've heard this phrase, and I think we probably all have, is like you're the sum of the five closest people next to you, right? And so, at the time, I'm only surrounded by trees and sticks, right? So I get to choose who my company is, right? So, I start downloading every single book that I feel is going to be helpful, whether it's, autobiographies, whether it's self-help. And I start recognizing like I can choose every single day to be around the five most emotionally intelligent, the most emotionally available, the most spiritually inclined people in the world, right? And then I can make this my entire circle. And so within there, by even just checking in with different stories from different timelines, I think Soledad Brother by George Jackson, right? Incredible. It's a book that's banned from prisons today. And, it's literally the story of him writing letters back to his family while he's on death row. And when you're even taking in the dialogue of his anger towards his mother and his parents, then you start saying like, man, I have an anger like that. Right. And like you're viewing it and like, man, you see where this anger gets him. Like, I wonder if this anger is going to bring me in the same place. I wonder if there's any other perspective that I can hold on this anger. Because I see how we've been conditioned to respond to this anger. But like, what if I gave myself just one extra perspective on this? Right. What if I gave myself more history? So like recognizing there was a time I spent so angry at a father, who had, an intense addiction, not recognizing like this man spent his first 4 or 5 years on a slave field as well, right? My grandmother came from picking cotton, did not know what Thanksgiving was in America in the 1950s because of what slavery looked like in South Carolina. And then 20 years later, entered the crack epidemic in Washington, D.C. Like nobody had a chance, right? So like I've been sitting here with this narrative that this man is selfish when I'm not recognizing this man is suffering, right? And so allowing myself to start working from the space of like, look, I understand some of the tools you utilize to get here. But if you want to get somewhere else, you're going to have to see if any other tools can work. Right. So let's just look at this journey. Let's look at, the steps we've taken and figure out, if there's anything else we could utilize to keep going.
Yeah. That's I love that. I mean, that's fantastic perspective. When you start talking about, opening up your aperture and, bringing in thoughts and messages from other, individuals over the course of time. I think about the question that people often ask, like, if you had an opportunity to have dinner with, three people, who would they be? You know what I mean? And it's like, we live in a time where we don't have to even ask that question, right? We can tap into their knowledge because it's all available to us, right? It doesn't have to be this aspiration. It can be very real. And I love how you kind of laid that out and how that ultimately propelled you into a journey of self-knowledge. I think that that's important. And, a lot of times, we get into these addictions because there is just unknown that is uncomfortable, right? So how do we lend some clarity and some context, and sometimes we have to go from outside to be able to do that, whereas with the alcohol we're trying to just numb it from the inside.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we're checking in with ourselves, I had to recognize, like, I spent so many different versions of myself and inside of so many identities where, a lot of these things were being reiterated just because of the environment that I was in. But then allowing myself to look inside in that moment and be like, okay, well, this is where that ecosystem got me, right? And I'm not villainizing it, I'm celebrating it because it did teach me a ton. But also recognizing that if I'm looking or seeking to explore anything else, right, that I'm going to have to bring in a completely new perspective, right? And so really allowing myself to say, like, well, what if everything we learned in South Atlanta was a lie, right? Like, what if everybody just tricked us, right? And who could I surround myself now and talk to them, just metaphorically, just by hearing their stories and being able to, sort of pinball their ideas, right? Who could give me a completely different perspective on what it meant to grow up in South Atlanta, right? Who could give me a completely different perspective on what it meant to be homeless? And I think the more that we spend time inside these conversations, at least just in my experience, like, the softer the space that we can create, the more that we can sift through it, right? The more that we feel empowered as we sift through it. And that's become, one of the things that really helps propel, who I am and what we do today is recognize, like, oh man, no, all of this is like celebratory material, right? Like, so, like, let's keep on digging, and like, it's going to give us more reason to celebrate tomorrow and like in this moment,
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about creating spaces. I know that just in reading about your journey, part of your story is the creation of space, right? And whether that be online spaces or whether that be spaces of opportunity. So I don't. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this. It really is up to you. But in creating your recovery road space, right, and the online community, what purpose was that to serve? And ultimately, did it serve its purpose, its intended purpose for you?
Man, I love that question, man. Thank you so much. And so, I think that's one of these times, once again, right? And like, what made Recovery Road so amazing is that, like, instead of being, invisible man, I decided to be transparent man for the world, right? So, in that moment, I just moved to New Orleans not too long ago. I had lost the first job I ever had. I was losing my apartment. The girl I was with also had just left back to Atlanta. And so, I was in this sort of panic, right? Of, oh, snap, I'm in the drinking capital of America now. And I don't have any foundation, right, of gratitude, right, that I can hold on to. And so, what we did, or what I did in that moment, is Reddit had this forum, or this platform called RPN, which is just like Instagram Live, but your channel can go to the whole world if everybody likes it, right? So I sat down, I created a page, or like sort of a live, and it was like, I don't want to relapse for the next hour. Who wants to hang out? And this is, as the pandemic's hitting, and me not realizing at that time, as I'm just speaking my truth, that there's millions of people around the world who are like, fuck, man, I really needed to address some of the ways I've been experiencing the pandemic. And so that first episode, we had 10,000 people, right? And I had no clue what I was going to do with it, but of the 10,000 people, I mean, we had like 1,000 comments that was like, man, if you came back tomorrow, I would be here. Like, I'd be here every day. And it started off with them just asking for my transparency of like, how did you survive being homeless? How did you get food? What happened when you lost your glasses? Right. And so for the first week, I was genuinely just describing like, this is the intelligence I learned being homeless. This is the intelligence I learned from alcohol. And in that moment, I all of a sudden started seeing all these responses, right? And now I just saw this, like, there's a book by Howard Gardner called Multiple Intelligences that like fleshes this out in a much more fluid way. But in this moment, right, because, second day we have 20,000. By the end of the week, we're having 60,000 people a day, right? And they're constantly reiterating, I never knew that you could think like this about that type of experience. All right. And all I'm doing in these moments is I'm relaying the information that my grandmother taught me, right? I'm relaying the information that I watched, my mother experience. Right. And this brand new world is telling me, yo, I've been in therapy for years, never had this thought before. I've done this for years, never realized you can think of it like this. And it sparked something. I'm like, wait, I've created my own, or like, this is wisdom, right? Like through my experiences and through my stories, I have gone to my own university, right? And I do have like a genuine perspective to be able to talk about this. And so, from there, I think after like day 6, I like did create like, all right, we're going to do this for a year. I have no clue what it's going to turn into, but I do believe that like the universe is, not what does this mean to me, but right, what do I mean to this, right? So, right, if the universe is conspired in this way to put 60,000 people in front of me to say this, then I'm going to be of service to the universe and say that it probably knows a little bit more than me in this moment. And so I didn't have a job. I started treating it just like a 9 to 5. I put in 9 hours every single day on our product for the next morning. And, next thing you know, it became, one of the most popular health and wellness shows in the world, and, from there, ended up having therapy companies and famous people reach out and be like, yo, you're a therapist and you just didn't know it. And next thing you know, they're giving me courses and accreditations. And, now it's, a full-time gig, and so, yeah, I literally get paid to do what I used to do for free, which people told me growing up, like that was the goal. Right. So, all right. They always say, do what you love and it's never a job. And I created my own job. Right. And so, it's a blessing to be able to experience that.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. We got a little bit more time here. I want to get into Santana's foundation and how you transition from living in this virtual world to very much living in an analog world that you live in today. Creating equity in the communities that you're working with. And so, can you tell us a little bit about that and how that what's the through line back to your recovery and why you're doing a lot of the work that you're doing today?
Yeah. And, genuinely, this is another, just one of those moments of like, what do I mean to this moment? So, we had hit this point maybe 30 days in, where, the show wasn't making any money yet because I hadn't figured out that, focus. And I did not have any cash to be able to stay in New Orleans. And so I just started asking the people watching the show, all right, this is the budget I have. I have $500. And I think I need another 3 months to be able to really focus on this show. And I said specifically, I want to go in a place where, Black people are welcomed and celebrated. And then somebody literally sent a message. They're like, hey, in Oaxaca City, Mexico, we pray to a guy who looks like you. Right. And at the time I had an afro and I'm like, what are you talking about? And they send me the whole story, Templo de Santo Domingo, right, in the center of the city. And there is Saint Martin, a brother with a huge afro. And there is all these Afro descendants that I didn't even know Southern Mexico had, right? But all these Spanish people who identify as Afro descendants and, they're celebrating this. And so, it started off with me going down to Oaxaca, having no clue we were going to be doing anything outside of just Recovery Road. I get hit by a car my first week, break my collarbone, break everything. And, everyone's like, yo, you could probably give up right now. Um, but I recognize, like, if I keep on going, because I'm talking this happiness thing, right? If I show up tomorrow full of gratitude with a broken collarbone and all this, like, the universe is going to pay off. Like, people are going to recognize, like, this isn't just talk, right? And in that moment, right, we also recognize how expensive, because, like, I didn't have the money to pay for a hospital. So my neighbor had to literally help me out with some water because I couldn't afford water at the time. And it gave us an insight to how expensive water is, not just for me, but for everybody in this part of the city I was living. And it turned into, my neighbor giving me water, to the whole, group on Recovery Road who was watching this being able to provide free water for the city. And then from there, next thing you know, people from all over the world were like, hey, man, can you come to our city and, provide, some service? And, that was about 3.5, 4 years ago. It actually is more than 4 years ago. And yeah, now I'm doing the exact same thing. Was invited to be of service in Nairobi, Kenya. We have a community kitchen here, taking care of about 200 kids. And from there, the universe is starting to blossom in all these new ways. We have a reading program going. We're bringing in an art program, and yeah, I'm just being of service, right?
Man, every once in a while, I have conversations where you can quite literally see the ripple effects of one's healing, and yours clearly are far-reaching. And I think it's just such a great story, which is by no means over. Right? There's so many more chapters that I feel like to be written at this point. But hats off to you in pursuing the moments that were calling you, without necessarily even knowing in the moment what it was calling for.
Exactly. And I think that's one thing I'm constantly inviting us to, right? Is that, like, even us waking up in this morning, that was not just our determination, right? We woke up this morning in collaboration, right? The universe is
Yep.
conspiring to say, like, nah, man, I got to see Ray this morning. Excited about the way that I could show up as Ray this morning, right? The universe shows up
Yep.
through each and every one of us. And so, each morning when we, are blessed enough to wake up, ask, like, man, what is the universe trying to do through me today? And allow ourselves to just be in collaboration. And, incredible how much celebration you find, through that path.
No, totally. I had a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I have a few more questions as we kind of like end our conversation. But one is, where did your nickname Brandon Be Happy come from? I think anyone who's spent any time watching, we've heard the laugh, right? But where does Brandon Be Happy come from?
So it, like, I've had nicknames growing up. It was either Happy, it was Smiley. It was always my nickname. And then as I was just allowing myself to sort of get on this pathway, it's not, and it's tough to understand it, but it's Brandon Be Happy, right? It's not that Brandon just be happy all the time. It's, Brandon, be happy.
Got you.
And so really, it's a little bit more of an invitation, right, to the gratitude, right, to the reflection, like, I could be happy right now.
Got you. Well, that makes sense for sure. And in that, I have a question. So you've obviously, in your work, in your travels, you've had a pretty healthy sample size of the human condition. So I'm curious, at this point in your life, what does happiness mean to you?
That is a great question, right? And so, happiness is, as I see it today, it's a result, all right? And so, I'm never just focusing on happiness, right? Happiness is like the cake, all right? But I'm focusing on the ingredients. So, recognizing that, like, all right, how am I with my gratitude this morning, right? How am I with my patience this morning? How am I within my connections with my community this morning? And recognizing that, when I'm able to find the right ingredients for, the dish that I'm trying to make just for the day, right? Is that's where I'm able to find the happiness. And so, allowing ourselves to recognize it's not something that we want to be contained by or constrained by, right? It is something that, as we are adding in all of these different spices and flavors in life, that we just get to experience, right? And so, yeah, happiness is a final result of some great processes and steps.
Nice. I love that. Two last questions for you, Brandon, and we'll close out here. One, and with understanding that the audience, potentially someone is sitting out there and they're saying to themselves, there's, in a self-evaluation, maybe I have an issue that I need to address here. Maybe there's some pain that I need to address. Maybe I need to address this alcohol. It's not serving me anymore, but I don't necessarily even know what my first step is going to be in this discovery and healing process. What would you say to that person?
I think I would say to that person is that you're already inside of the step. All right. I think that awareness is the first step. Right. And then allowing ourselves from that state of awareness, right, to sort of break down the barriers, right, that have sort of contained us maybe in, this season that we are now aware that we are ready to transition out of. Right. And so right now, if we've been drinking, if we've been screaming, if we've been any of these things, right, and we're saying, hey, I'm ready for transition, right? And then just sort of allowing ourselves to say, like, okay, if I'm already aware of it, what are the things that hold me to this, right? What are some of the reasons why I am comfortable with doing this? And what are some of the things outside of it that I would just like to experience, all right? And then start to say, like, yeah, well, right now, this is my tool for anxiety. Well, it sounds like what I'm asking myself in this moment is I would like to change the way I deal with anxiety, right? And so, like, am I willing to break down the barrier of, yeah, there's only one way to deal with anxiety is screaming, it's this? No, all right? How about I give myself just the faith, right? That this thought isn't even mine, right? This thought, the universe is in collaboration to give me this idea, to allow me to be aware, right? That there is possibly another version of me who is available. And am I willing enough to just surrender to that, right? And say, like, yeah, I think I could just try this out in another way.
Yeah. Openness, surrender, being vulnerable and honest with yourself. I mean, that's all of the things that I'm hearing, and I appreciate that perspective. Last question I have, and I preface this question by saying, in communities of color, our mental health is often not a focus, right? And sometimes can be the ultimate detriment, to us as individuals, and perhaps even more broadly speaking, as a people. My question for you is, in some of your darkest days when you were really going through that kind of internal tussle and struggle with identity and medicating that with alcohol, how would someone from the outside have known that you were struggling without you explicitly telling them so?
Oh, that's a great question. And, just to be 100% honest, as we can do our best to try and understand each other. But in reality, it's a personal journey. All right. And so what looks like drowning to me might look like swimming to you. All right. And so I'm always inviting us to come back to our understanding of this before we try and push our understanding on another. Yeah. So I think I invite that.
Awesome. Well, Brandon, look, we're going to close this out. I want to make sure that folks can find you, potentially even support the work that you're doing at Santana's Foundation. Could you leave the audience with a few kind of data points that they can use to come back to Brandon and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, feel more than welcome to, just find us on social media. All right. Me personally at Brandon BE Happy. All right. All one word. You can find the nonprofit at Santana's Fund, FUND. Santana's like Carlos Santana, right? Or you can always check out the website, santanasfoundation.org. And yeah, I think also if you're just looking for this space, and one of the things I would like to leave us with is, we are, the neighborhood nonprofit, right? And I am maybe one of the most regular humans you've ever met in your life. So, in a lot of ways, I would love for your support, but also taking the time to just use this as a mirror to celebrate yourself, right? What I'm doing, any and every single person who is listening to this can do, is just allowing ourselves to sort of surrender, right? Once again, and allow that reality that maybe how I see myself isn't big enough to do this. But lucky enough, like, I'm in collaboration with the universe who's deciding to wake me up, right? And maybe the universe is big enough to allow me to accomplish some of these, intuitions, these whisperings that it keeps on giving me. So, yeah, thanks a ton, Ray. I really appreciate the time and, man, support everything that you're doing.
You got it, man. And vice versa. I was saying before our show that I'm going to be in Nairobi in about a month from now, and I definitely want to get some time with Brandon and get an opportunity to get out into the community and lend some support with my own hands. So let's make sure that we stay in contact on that. Post the interview, Brandon. Have a great rest of the day, man, and we'll be in contact shortly about our next steps, because I think the collaboration is just beginning.
Incredible, man. Thank you so much. And yeah, man, be talking to you real soon.
I appreciate you guys listening to the Stacking Days podcast. I hope this episode added value to your recovery and wellness journey. Before we go our separate ways, let's connect on social. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Stacking Days, or via the website www.stackingdays.com. By supporting the show, you can play a direct role in amplifying people of color in their pursuit of recovery. The easiest way to do that is to subscribe or hit the follow button. This way, you'll never miss an episode, all while playing an active part in creating the ecosystem where diverse voices in healing matter. This show is for the purpose of education and connection and is not a replacement for therapy or recovery care. For more information on the resources and support available, take a look at SAMHSA and some other resources shared in the description. Until we meet again, be well, one day at a time.